Hi, folks. Let's see. I looked at some of the other talks from the session, and this is going to be a less scholarly one. So you could probably put the notebooks down. This is more exactly what I'm telling you, a fish inside the fishbowl, telling you what science journalism looks like to him right now from his seat. It's kind of interesting. I gave a talk at University of Wisconsin in 2015 on the same theme, and so this in some ways is an update of that talk. So if these some of the slides look familiar, most of them I've had to redo, it turns out. That's uh, that's the explanation. Let's see. So you heard the introduction. Some of you might know. I'm basically the last of the silver age of science journalists, the people in the 1990s who went to journalism school thinking that science journalism was a healthy career to go into. Um, and I've been, as you said, at interesting places. I got a little bar chart here to be pseudoscientific, sort of where I was versus the reach, where like a five on my scale is, a national newspaper type thing, which was USA Today and BuzzFeed News, and a three is like a magazine, National Geographic and Siam, where I'm now, and a one is a startup or at a something like Medical Tribune, a very small outlet where I kind of started. So I've seen all the ups and downs, basically, of science journalism, is what I'm trying to say. So that's where I'm coming from. FY. I should also say at the outset, I don't. My views don't represent those of Scientific American or the Springer Nature Corporation that owns it. My views are my own here, so it's none of their fault if I say something they don't like. To begin, I usually tell people like what I do. So reporting essentially is telling people stories. Um, the only catch is it's what really happened. So two kids went up a hill, they fell down and they broke their crowns. I write it up in a story fashion. The most important thing in the journalism that I do is I try and call people to get reaction to it, a critical perspective on the whole thing, right? It's not enough to just say a news release from the sheriff's office say this happened. You have to call people who are experts at Hillside Wells and find out what happened to Jack and Jill from their perspective. You have to talk to their parents. Unfortunately, you have to call around and get a critical look at all this. If you're not checking things out, which is the way we think of journalism in the area I come from, then it ain't really journalism. Um, so the kind of journalism that I do, I'm going to skip through the slides because I'm going to get to the questions. They're probably more important than anything I talk to, is science journalism, where I tend to think of myself as a news person who reports things from a scientific angle. And that puts me in the body of people who are often called science reporters or science writers, as distinct from science communicators or science popularizers or science influencers or things like that. It really are people who try to have this critical perspective on science. And this is a joke when I say it has a proud history. The one place you could start if you were going to do a history of science reporting is the origins of the National Association of Science Writers. Uh, I'm no longer a member. It's a group today of about 2,400 people, thereabouts. It started as a cabal of six or seven men, science writers, who wanted to essentially tell scientists in the height of the depression, hey, you know what? When you do a news story, you should really just talk to us because we're certified science guys, um, and not talk to other people. And it's gotten wider, as you can imagine, the field from there. You got the Hiroshima, you have Sputnik, you have the moon landing, you have 3 Mile Island, and the field kind of grew to the extent that in 1971, 72, I think, thereabouts, the New York Times started a science section in newspapers, which kicked off a trend that went until about 1990. Um, there was something like 100 science sections in newspapers around this country, each one employing editors, reporters, visual people, the whole deal. Um, Now there's back to one. It's the New York Times science section, and it's thin compared to what it used to be. Likewise, for science magazines, Scientific American was revitalized after Hiroshima. Science became a popular thing. There were other magazines. By the 80s, there was a boom, and now that's kind of retreated. I think we only run 11 issues on paper a year, and it's a much thinner thing than it used to be, which is going to be a theme I talk about in my talk here. So back in the last talk I gave, and this been my standard slide for a long time, is what the hell does a science reporter do? The traditional science reporter, what you did was you wrote up study says stories. This isn't actually what I do, but this is the sort of the typecast or the tradition for science reporters. Um, Science reporting is largely what's a polite word? It's a scam. You are told in advance in a lot of cases that this stuff is coming. Science puts out a tip sheet Sunday night. Nature, I think, does it Thursday, saying about, hey, in about a week, we're going to have these 6 studies coming out. Do you want to cover one of them? We'll give you a copy of it and we'll give you the phone number for the lead author, and you go crazy. This is dated back to behavior in the late 50s. There was a fellow called Ingelfinger at JAMA. You may be familiar with it, the Ingelfinger rule, basically telling scientists not to violate the embargo on their study coming out or else. And it was a way to let the paper in Omaha compete with the New York Times on even ground to report these stories out. Basically, it was back then. They were actually mailing the journals, and as late as the 1990s, people would wait for the New England Journal to come in the mail ahead of time in newsrooms in order to decide to report something or not. We can talk about the embargo system. I've been wrong for 20 years now, thinking the embargo system would collapse, and it's as strong as ever. But like this is a lot of science reporting, the sort of traditional kind is done. Um, Not so much what I do. I tend to do science stories in the news. A lot of pandemic, a lot of anthrax, a lot of Havana syndrome, a lot of overdose crisis, a lot of um, what the hell is RFK doing in the sauna with this rock guy, that sort of thing, sort of more news from a technical aspect. But just so you understand, when people talk about science reporting, this is often what they mean. And I hope I'm not going too fast to slow me down if somebody has a question or jumping up and down or whatever. But like I said, I want to get through my little part of the talk, so the questions are probably more interesting. So it also bears, here's how the hell does that work? People sometimes get confused. It's this simple and stupid. And that's why it's so easy to mess up. Science reporting is really simple. That's why it's easy to mess up, right? You get a tip sheet, you read the news release, you throw it away, you read the study, you call the guy who wrote the study or the woman who wrote the study most often, ask them what it means. Then you talk to people who are experts in it. The cheap way to do that is to go with the references, the citations and the thing, and find out who the person who disagrees with them is, and then call them and ask them for questions. You write up a little story in the pyramid style, and voila, you have um, a science news story. Scientists have discovered a kind of neutron star that looks like a donut. Gee whiz, said the chief scientist at NASA. That's how it goes. Um, as you can see from my notes, here's the first change, really. This is all stuff that an LLM type AI can kind of do a crappy job at now. And in fact, we've had things called spinners for like the last 15 years that aren't even AI, but just sort of like play Mad Libs to explain what happened in the study. And you see these sometimes showing up on your low rent news sites. Um, but this is it. If you go to science journalism school, there's nice ones at NYU, University of Santa Cruz, MIT. They will teach you, I think, in the first semester how to write one of these suckers up. And the thing is that in 1970, what did was you got paid $1 a word for one of these things if you were a freelancer. And in 1995, if you did one of these things, you got paid $1 a word for it. And in 2020, well, 2026, let's say, you got paid 50 cents a word. So the field has devolved from a middle class way to make a living into a kind of gig economy thing. It's tough to make a living doing this. In 2015, when I was an editor at National Geographic, that's wrong. When in 2013, we were paying people $600 for one of these stories. 500 words, $600, and if you were really good, we would let you do 3 a month. Um, that sounds like it leaves a lot of time for other stuff, but an apartment in DC costs $3,400 a month. So it turns out it's not really that great a way to like make a living. So some baseline economics, as I sit there and think, do I want to be a freelancer? It's like, it's not so simple sometimes of these things. Why is that? Okay, let's talk about the big picture, the news industry, right? The news industry is a disaster. We've been losing jobs for actually since 1990, but it really, took off after 2001, 2008. And what happened? Well, the internet happened and advertising disappeared. So the way that it worked before was there were a lot of print ads. They cost a lot of money. They supported a lot of people. Digital ads, there's gazillions of them and they don't hardly pay anything. They don't support people. This has really come to a head in the last year. It's hit science reporters very hard. The Wall Street Journal uh, let people go. Though you know what happened to the Washington Post? They let go of their climate team as well as cutting half the newsroom. Um, CBS is laying people off and hiring wellness influencers to replace some of them somehow. Um, and the thing is, the traffic is falling. When I was at BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed was basically a Facebook machine. The way that it worked was stories from BuzzFeed got posted to Facebook. Facebook elevated them. More people read them. More ads came in. Facebook sold its own advertising business, and it was a happy cycle for everybody. The problem was that Mark Zuckerberg decided he would rather have that money than BuzzFeed, and so he just cut us off and he killed BuzzFeed News. It took a couple years, but that's what happened. Same thing's happening now with Google. Google is the internet. Like, there's lawsuits and everything like that. I'm not a lawyer, but Google basically is a monopolist that owns the internet. Search is the internet. And right now, when you do a search, what you get at the top of it is an AI summary of our stories, which is not really an AI summary. It's just theft. They've just stolen our stuff, our copy, and they've lightly rewritten it and pasted it there. And you go to that and they put their ad next to it so we don't get a nickel for it. And that's cut traffic anywhere from 50 to 30% at online news organizations that are dependent on search traffic for the money that they do get. This probably isn't news to you guys, so I won't dwell on this, but take a question. But it's such that it's if you are a reporter now, you expect to get laid off at some point. I mean, I got bought out at BuzzFeed, and that was considered a good outcome. It was a good outcome. They put a bunch of money in my pocket to go away, but which beats getting fired by a lot. But things like that are just common. I've been furloughed, everything but laid off, and we'll see how that goes. I still got a few years to go before retirement. Again, I hope I'm not going too fast, but I'm trying to get through these slides here, and I got a whole lot of really important things to say. Um, when you hear people talk about the mainstream media, that I'm part of the mainstream media or whatever, it turns out that's just nonsense. There is no mainstream media left anymore. Mainstream media actually is Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn and the influencers and things like that, the talking heads on the radio. And what I do in the news is this very boutique thing that only 10% of the population is really interested in. And how do I know that's true? Well, it was RFK Jr.'s anniversary 1 year at the HHS in control of it. And I Oh my God, how much of that did you miss? I just was talking to myself madly like a fool for the last 20 minutes. Oh, good. We got as far as RFK in the toilet seat. Great. So basically, why does he talk to an influencer and not to the Associated Press? Because they matter to him and we don't, right? His voters don't read Scientific American. He thinks they don't read the Associated Press. So that's who he talks to. And that's a reflection of the real power in media these days. Media is a garbage word. There's no such thing. Any speaker in the series who talks to you about the media there's no such thing. But it, for whatever it is, the waterfront of places where people get their news, influencers now matter much more than us. So have I hopefully I've discouraged everyone from going into journalism. Like this is my big goal here. Um, So just to beat this to death, what are the economics of this? There's a couple of economic ways to look at what's happened in the journalism business from inside. And remember, I'm the fish telling you this, so I'm not an economics professor. But this one simple way is to look at the demand for advertising. Back in the days when the USA Today was printed on paper, and that's where we made all our money, you had, demand for news and you had the supply of ads, right? It was an inelastic supply of ads. There were 36 pages in the newspaper and it had only so many pages. It can get more and it can get less. And so when you have inelastic supply and you have a certain demand, all the money under that triangle in there, that goes into the pockets of the people selling the ads, right? So that paid for a lot of reporters and things like that. But when you have elastic advertising supply, infinite supply of ads from Google, doesn't matter. There ain't no under anything under here. And Google, but you might have caught on, is like pretty good at scooping up ad money. They don't give much to us. And so that's one explanation for why it collapsed. Another explanation from Economics 101 is that news is actually a public good. It's information, right? And so when you sell a public good like a commodity, you have what's called a market failure. And so that's broadly, news is a giant case of a market failure. Um, you could have things like the BBC in the UK or the Corporation for Public Broadcasting somehow subsidizing news in this country, but we decided a long time ago we don't like that because we don't want the government to have control over what the news is. That kind of idea has kind of gone out of fashion. You may have noticed in this current administration, they're more hip with that, kind of in a direction that doesn't make people who want critical news reporting happy. There's a nice report I'm touting here from the Roosevelt Institute by a scholar named Victor Pickard, who's been very thoughtful, I think, about the sort of systematic, the economics 301 over my idiotic, simple explanations for what's going on. That's worth checking out. And he's got sort of like the four different levels at which this sort of market failure has taken place that I'm talking about. Anyways, all this I'm telling you about the decline in science reporting and reporting in general is a shame because there's no shortage of science news, right? Uh, uh, I, we've had a pandemic. We have this charmer, in charge of the HHS, doing all kinds of interesting things. We have basically the collapse of the compact between science and the US government that's been in place since the end of World War II. Um, we have all kinds of exciting things going on in space, some kind of wacky things going on in space. We have fantastic material science, fantastic biology, fantastic advances in medicine, biomedicine, all kinds of wonderful news. And we have fewer and fewer reporters to do it because there isn't money to support the thing. And it's not that people aren't interested, really, even though, the statistics say fewer people seeking out the news. It's a country of 340 million people. If only 10% of them are interested, that's 34 million people. Still a lot of people to make money off of. But the problem is the transmission vehicle to get them their interest translated into a living for people to do good work has become more and more occluded with middlemen taking advertising money away from us. So what's the result? We now live in a much denuded era for sort of science news from my viewpoint. It's an influencer era, right? Like you have people who don't really have a journalistic outlook on things, often delivering you the science. They might be in a good case. They're Bill Nye. They're a science communicator. These are all men, by the way. 1934, all men forming National Association of Science Writers. To 2026, 8 out of 10 top Instagram influencers, they're men, right? Draw what conclusion from that you want. I put up a picture on this slide of Kelsey Harper, who's our own very good visual reporter, one of them at Scientific American, does a fantastic job doing really nice, evenly presented work. Very thoughtful person. A model. Like if you are interested in this, if you are interested in science journalism or science communication, God forbid, take classes in visual media rather. Learn how a camera works. Learn how to do this stuff because it's a lot of the skills that are needed now. When I was a child in 1995, and I learned science reporting, all I had to learn how to do was like how to pitch a story, how to write news copy, and like how to show up on time at a news conference, right? That was all I really needed to do. I could get a job. Now you have to know how to do all these things, but you also know how to do a podcast, do some reporting from a live shot. You have to really sort of almost be Al Franken style every person to have the skills to get you hired these days. I threw in a picture of this guy, Phil McKnight here, who's a guitar guy who I watch. He has 461,000 subscribers on YouTube. He thinks of himself as a guy who talks about guitars. He's actually becoming a journalist. When something goes wrong in the guitar business, he calls the manufacturer, he calls people who are experts in guitars, and he reports it out to the people watching him. And he thinks what he's doing is telling people about this problem in the guitar business. And he's actually acting as a journalist. It's one of the things that gives me some hope is that eventually some of these influencer crowd, there'll be such a demand for real information, for honest information, that maybe the influencer era will mature into something bigger. And maybe we'll all get jobs working for these guys and it'll actually be back to critical journalism again. Um, We're also in the AI era. Uh, there was a Cleveland Plain Dealer editor who made a big splash this week by saying we don't actually need reporters to write anymore. What we do is we hire our reporters to be stringers. They feed the AI. The AI writes the story. An editor looks at it, and we publish it. And we're saving lots of time and money not having to hire reporters to write these stories because, the AI writes a perfectly good news story from the stuff that the reporters go out and get, and that's fine. They're not going to be very good stories. Right now the LLMs, they don't have a lot of flair. I think you could say that might be okay because Google has trained people to expect kind of mediocre writing, and maybe that's what we'll get. It seems too bad to me, but I think that's definitely a trend. On the other hand, machine learning is a fantastic tool for uh, for reporting, and it's again, if you want to distinguish yourself as a reporter, if you're young, good thing to get into is to figure out how to do this. The Times gave a nice description of how they're digging into the Epstein files. They have 20 reporters on it, and in 2 weeks they could only get through 3% of the files. But they could use a large language model to search through things. It's basically not a large language model, actually. Forgive me. It's machine learning that's going through the files and collating them and sorting them and giving them a table of contents. I'll tell you a trick. I tried to put the first batch of the Epstein files into something called Google Pinpoint, which uses the Gemini LLM, and I asked it to make a table of contents of these 13,000 documents for me. And what it produced was a table of contents after thinking about it for like 3 hours, and it turned out it was a table of contents from a jewelry ad that was in the Epstein files that it produced, like very proudly, like not very helpful, Gemini. Um, there's a thing also I put in here that was a nice story that a colleague of mine named Peter Aldhouse did. I think is a wonderful example of how machine learning can help. He took flight records of the FBI and actually the nation's flight records, and he found out of it where the FBI was circling mosques in the middle of Trump's Muslim deportation effort in his first administration. He pulled these circles out and basically found out these pilots were doing a great job, except on the weekends when they knocked off. So, not a very serious effort in all told. So I'm not anti-AI. I'm just saying like it's a tool that we need to learn to use as a field. And finally, it's an atomized error, right? Right, I have here is Maria Cabas, Chris Geidner, Supreme Court reporter, Heat Map is a climate site, and the Open Notebook is, you probably know it very well, Wisconsin, terrific site for science reports, just fantastic resources. Um, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, all these people would all be in one news outlet, and it would be a fantastically muscular and powerful news outlet. Now, to make a living, they all sort of have to do their little small niche and drive into it as hard as they can. If they have 75,000 subscribers, they celebrate. It's a shame. We're back to I.F. Stone and his newsletter, essentially, which is 80 years ago in terms of like where the state of the art of news reporting is, the newsletter era, some people have called it. Um, so the deal is like you no longer have a job at a news outlet, right? You have an anchor job that is how you pay the rent, right? You work at a pizza shop, or you work for public affairs at a university, or you maybe work at some kind of pseudo news outlet, or maybe you work at a news outlet. I worked at for a show called Health Week on PBS for 2 years before I moved to USA Today, and I was a researcher there basically, and I freelanced around it. So you're essentially a freelancer. I mean, of a very frenzied kind, and a lot of people are cool with that. When I talk to the students at NYU or UC Santa Cruz, they understand that, but it seems like a lot more work to me. And the reporting that you do is naturally less well informed or less fulsome because you got to hustle just to get that 600 word piece up. Um, it's a busier life. It's a 7 days a week working thing that you have to accept. It's a hell of a thing. Where does this end? I think there's two ways that it ends. One is that it just goes on like this, and we have a essentially a news environment where very wealthy people get very nice products and get pretty good news from it. There'll be less variety. So you sort of have the New York Times effect where that's like all they read. They don't read the LA Times, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Indianapolis paper, the USA Today, the Washington Post, the Miami Herald, the Atlanta Cons, the sort of waterfront of news sources we had back in the day. Or the other alternative is that, we step in and do something about it. There have been these efforts to take antitrust measures against Google, which, is the bad guy if you're sitting in my seat. Um, but the real problem, of course, is just the decision we've made as a country since the early 70s to treat news as a business just like any other and not a civic responsibility in a democracy. You see this in things like Jeff Bezos throwing the Post over the side, like he could give a damn about the news. Clearly, he feels no sense of responsibility to the people who've incorporated his businesses and made him super wealthy. He's the hell with them. Um, at some point, if we want to have a democracy full of well-informed people, then something like this stuff has to come through. And that's my political statement here, which is why I don't speak for the magazine or a corporation or anything like that. Anyways, I was trying to get through this to get the question, so I'm sorry for the internet outage and for hurrying and like just yelling at you this whole talk. Uh, but anyways, here's a slide that I gave back in 2015. This was I opened before, and so I'm just leaving this here as like a caution that I'm just the fish in the bowl and I don't know anything. And in 2015, like I thought this was really profound, this slide, and every prediction I made there turned out to be wrong about where the news was going. I really thought BuzzFeed was going to be a cool thing and last forever. Um, so whatever I say here, take it in that spirit as like this is what just some reporter says from inside the fishbowl. He might be totally wrong. Things might go in a total different direction. Um, anyways, that's my hurried version of the talk with a couple interruptions for my crazy internet. And you probably have better questions, or we could talk about anything if you want to talk about a recent story or something I've totally ignored. Let's just go ahead. Is that reasonable?